Hello there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, some polls are tightening. Is that because they're biased or fake, or is Trump really gaining ground?
Maybe it's all the music that he's playing instead of talking at his rallies. We'll be looking at that as well. But first,
it's been a week of increasingly extreme rhetoric from Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump. In fact, according to an analysis by the New York Times, Trump's speeches have grown darker, harsher, longer, angrier, less focused, more profane, and increasingly fixated on the past. Certainly, Trump's anti-immigrant tirades have gone way beyond anything supported by the facts. Take this from a speech in the swing state of Nevada this week.
You cannot get into a hospital, by the way, because the migrants have all of the beds. You cannot get into a hospital. You cannot get your kids into a school because there are migrants there that don't even speak the language. It's unbelievable. They're giving, because of Biden and Kamala, they're giving precedence over your children.
It is unbelievable, literally unbelievable. According to journalist Bob Woodward's new book, War, the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, now says that Trump is, quote, fascist to the core and, quote, the most dangerous person to this country. And maybe this is the kind of thing that General Milley has in mind when Trump was asked on Fox News this week about the potential for election-related violence.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of election day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
and remember, he's been likening migrants to Hannibal Lecter for the past 6 months, but now he's saying that left-wing protesters are worse than, well, Hannibal Lecter, and that they should maybe be put down by the military? That's not a new thought either for Trump. Recall what Trump's Defense Secretary Mark Esper said about Trump's reaction to the George Floyd protests in Washington.
What specifically was he suggesting that the U.S. military should do to these protesters?
He says, can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something. And he's suggesting that that's what we should do, that we should bring in the troops and shoot the protesters.
The commander-in-chief was suggesting that the U.S. military shoot protesters.
Yes, in the streets
American
of our nation's
protesters.
capital. That's right.
And the fact that Trump has returned to exactly the same thought on camera this time suggests to me that he's thinking about that a bit. And we shouldn't treat it like Trump just mouthing off. We should probably take it seriously.
Mark Esper certainly takes it seriously again this week, saying he is convinced that Trump would use the American military against the political left in America, the enemy within.
There you go. On Bob Woodward, though, Trump has denied these stories entirely, but we should note that as far as last week's story goes from Bob Woodward, that Trump has spoken to Putin on the phone as many as 7 times since he lost the presidency, well, Trump has actually already admitted to speaking to Putin on at least one occasion. This was him talking about the Afghanistan withdrawal.
When Putin saw that, he said, you know what? I think we're going to go in and maybe take this was his dream. I talked to him about it, his dream.
I talked to him about it. I think Woodward might be winning this round, John.
So far. And as for whether Trump and Putin have been having more frequent chatty chats than that, Trump's denial has shifted somewhat in the last couple of days, telling Bloomberg News, I don't comment on that, before adding, but if I did, it's a smart thing. Other things that Trump has said and done this week also seem to defy not just the US Constitution or the facts, but political logic. Like this, insulting the city of Detroit in front of the Detroit Economic Club.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president.
And that quickly made it into an attack ad from the Harris campaign.
We believe in freedom. We don't bow down to nobody, and we never will. And so what Donald Trump doesn't understand, or care to learn, is that when he said,
Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president,
that he should be so goddamn lucky.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
And Kamala Harris released her medical records this week, her doctor concluding the 59-year-old is in, quote, excellent health and possesses the physical and mental resiliency required to serve as president. Donald Trump's former doctor famously alleged that Trump himself dictated his own 2015 medical report, claiming at the time that he'd be the healthiest individual ever elected to the presidency and that his physical strength and stamina are extraordinary. Vale Dr. Bornstein. Trump's campaign this week, though, says the 78-year-old is in perfect and excellent health to be the commander-in-chief, based on a 3-paragraph letter from his doctor last year. Harris is claiming that Trump's refusal to release current and detailed health information or take part in another debate or a 60 Minutes interview proves that his campaign has something to hide.
Why does his staff want him to hide away? One must question, are they afraid that people will see that he is too weak and unstable to lead America?
Classic switcheroo. Now Trump's the old guy hiding in his basement, won't talk to the media. And Trump did nothing to dispel concerns about his mental state with a very strange event in Pennsylvania yesterday, a town hall hosted by South Dakota's dog-killing governor, Kristi Noem. Their chat with a sprinkling of vetted questions from Trump supporters was interrupted twice by audience members fainting.
Take your time, doctor.
At one point, Trump called for the funereal Ave Maria to be played over the PA system. Then he called on the sound guy, Justin, to play yet more music instead of taking any more questions.
Let me hear that music, please.
And for almost 40 minutes, Trump stayed on stage, swaying, occasionally dancing to James Brown, Sinead O'Connor, the Village People. Mostly, though, he just kind of stood there. It was quite odd. So odd that Kamala Harris tweeted, "Hope he's okay."
Yeah, I got to say, I think that was a bit ordinary from Harris there and from a number of left-wingers online. Trump ended the rally after 40 minutes because it was hot, it was stuffy, and people were fainting. He was talking about the air conditioning not being on, etc. While 40 minutes might be a long rally for Harris, for Trump, that is a very short rally. He usually goes much longer. So he ended the rally, he said goodbye, it's over, and he said, I'm just going to hang around for a while, and invited people to leave when they wanted to, just playing music while he was standing there. Probably because he wanted to give them slightly more value that he didn't leave the stage. To me, it's not a big deal. What do you reckon?
Well, I don't think there's any value in sitting around watching Donald Trump try to dance on stage. I think it's a very generous interpretation that you're giving there. It was a town hall only in the sense that Kristi Noem was asking Trump questions, saying how great Trump was, and then taking a few questions from the audience, which Trump clearly grew bored of answering, which is why after about 50 minutes, Kristi Noem said, please, can we just take a couple more? He said, no, I'm not going to take any more questions. And then he said goodbye, and then he played some more music and said, Justin, put on some more music, including James Brown's It's a Man's World. I don't know what we're meant to make of all of that, but it was odd. It was unusual, maybe even weird.
I completely agree it's unusual. It's not something I would have done. And I'm not going to argue with the fact whether he was bored or not. I'm not sure. But I will say this. It was not an indication of him being senile or him being out of his mind like many on the left were suggesting online.
I don't think it was senility, contempt, disrespect for the audience, bad planning to have it in a hot hall in Pennsylvania that was overcrowded. I mean, there was no reason why people should be fainting just because they were standing around unless they were in some advanced medical condition. So it was hot and stuffy, didn't need to be. Bad planning and bad execution.
Okay, we can accept that.
All right then.
Anyway, we had a bit of policy from Trump this week as well. Adding to his growing suite of tax breaks, Trump announced another one in Detroit.
We will make interest on car loans fully deductible.
Now, I imagine auto dealers would be liking that policy, but I reckon there's a bit of a question mark about who that tax break is targeting. You see, the average new car owner only pays about $4,500 in interest. Sounds like a lot, but the standard default tax deduction is $29,000 for married couples or $14,500 for single people. So unless you have more itemised tax deductions than that, you'd be better off taking the standard tax deduction, which of course 90% of taxpayers do. So for that 90% of taxpayers, this policy here with this one deduction does zero. Even more questionable is this announcement. For Americans living overseas, like say in Paris, you have to pay tax in both France and America. And so in this case here, Trump said that he would end what he calls this double taxation, which again sounds great. Until you realise that expats only need to pay American income tax if they earn more than $126,000. And there's a deduction already for overseas housing expenses. And there's already a tax credit for any tax you pay to a foreign nation. Add that all up, and in the end, only the richest 18% of expats actually pay any American tax. And remember, expats are amongst the wealthier people to begin with anyway. The devil is always in the details. Over to Kamala Harris, and the last week or so has been about trying to shore up some of her weaker demographics, starting with Latino voters at a Univision town hall where Harris seemed to particularly bond with a woman who had recently lost her mother.
I was only able to help my dad get his legal status squared away, but not my mom's. My mom passed away just 6 weeks ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And she was never, ever able to get the type of care and service that she needed or deserved. Sorry.
Take your time. Take your time.
So my question for you is, what are your plans, or do you have plans to support that subgroup of immigrants who have been here their whole lives, or most of them, and have to live and die in the shadows?
I'm so sorry for you.
Thank you.
You must remember your mother as she lived.
They bonded so much so that an hour later, when the town hall ended, Harris went straight back to talking to her right until the credits rolled, and probably afterwards. Tim Walz was dispensed to work on the mail vote, and he tried to do it by hunting pheasants.
Nice shot.
Although Republicans were more interested in this clip, that made it look like Walz wasn't familiar with how to load his own gun. Awkward. The Harris campaign focused on the black male vote as well. Harris unveiled some policy, including legalising marijuana completely. That's a pretty big policy, which got almost no coverage somehow. And Barack Obama delivered an Obama-esque rally speech in Pittsburgh. Most telling, though, maybe was this little aside from Obama before his speech, where he shared his theory about why Harris might be struggling with black men.
And you're coming up with all kinds of reasons and excuses. I've got a problem with that because part of it makes me think, and I'm speaking to men directly now, part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for that.
It's a pretty telling move, I think. When surrogates start scolding their own base, it's an indication that things are getting tense. And I'll tell you how tense things are getting. Harris's campaign is even putting out attack ads against minnow Jill Stein.
Stein was key to Trump's 2016 wins in battleground states. She's not sorry she helped Trump win. That's why a vote for Stein is really a vote for Trump.
Jill Stein, I like her very much. You know why? She takes 100% from them.
Every single vote is going to count in this one, John.
Yeah, we found out one other person who likes Jill Stein today. David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the KKK and a former Democrat, also endorsed Jill Stein.
What an endorsement.
So, 3 weeks now until Election Day, and the polls continue to show a historically tight race for the White House, with potentially worrying signs for both sides as they pore over the crosstabs and the demographic breakdowns. It is likely, though, in a close election that Pennsylvania could very well be the decisive swing state. Trump won it in 2016, Joe Biden won it in 2020. So, this New York Times Siena poll showing Kamala Harris leading by 4 points in Pennsylvania would have had Democrats cheering. Except it came out in the same week as a slew of polls showing Trump leading in Pennsylvania. Redfield had Trump up by 2, Insider Advantage by 2, Fabrizio McLaughlin by 1, although they're Trump's pollsters, and Tip Insights also had Trump 1 point ahead. Some poll watchers, though, smelled a rat They noted that when the TIP pollsters screened for likely voters as opposed to all registered voters, they screened out almost everybody who took the survey in Pennsylvania's largest city, the Democratic stronghold of Philadelphia. They polled 124 registered voters in Philadelphia, but they only counted 12 of them as likely voters in their sample, just 1.5% of the likely voter sample, when Philadelphia has 10% of Pennsylvania's population. Seemed a bit weird. But pollsters also know that 1 in 3 registered voters can't be considered likely voters. They're not going to vote on election day. So the trick is to decide who is actually likely to vote. TIP says that most of those Philadelphia voters were unlikely to vote based on their survey answers, whether they'd voted in previous elections, were they registered now. But Democrat strategist Simon Rosenberg has a theory about what's really going on. He says Republicans, or R's, are rigging the polls.
With 3 weeks to go, we should note that R's have dropped more than 60 polls into the polling averages over the last few weeks to Red Wave 2024. The only reason they would be doing that is if they thought they were losing.
So maybe Republican firms are juicing these polls. Poll averages do often iron out the wrinkles in particular polls and provide a clearer picture. But if all of the polls being fed into that are inaccurate, then by definition, the averages will be inaccurate as well.
That's true, but to that end, the New York Times showed what their averages look like with and without Republican-leaning pollsters. The national numbers, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina and Pennsylvania, are all identical. And Michigan and Wisconsin are also pretty close to identical. So Simon Rosenberg might be overcooking his concern a tad there. Although then you've also got pundits like Mark Halperin who are holding their secret private polls over everyone's heads.
I just saw some new private polling today that's very robust private polling. She's in a lot of trouble.
Look, I remember similar talk before the 2022 midterms about this robust private polling and a gathering red wave, and it never seemed to come to shore. So I'm a little bit more sceptical about that.
Yes, 2022 was also the year where high school students conducting polls were being put into the 538 average. There were some issues. Speaking of the 538 national average, Kamala Harris is leading by 2.4 percentage points this week. A month ago, her lead was 3.3, though. Since then, Trump has gained almost a point, while Harris has stayed steady. The Cook Political Report average of 21 national polls also has Harris about 2 points ahead this week, gaining a little bit more than Trump over the past month. So, what to make of all of that? Political analyst Dave Wasserman is with us. He's the Cook Political Report's election analyst and one of the best in the business. Dave, welcome to Planet America.
Sure thing.
So what do you make of the tightening that we're seeing in a lot of polls at the moment, Dave? Are Harris supporters right to be feeling a little bit nervous right now?
The polls in these key battleground states are so close that who's in the lead is really hard to discern. Every one of these 7 key battleground states is within about a point, and that's well within the margin of error of these surveys. And another dynamic is that to the extent either candidate has been up or down, Kamala Harris's better states have been in the north, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Trump's better states have been in the south, particularly Arizona, Georgia, maybe if you squint, North Carolina. And yet in the last 10 years or so, we've seen more polling error underestimating Trump in the north, maybe a slight underestimation of Democrats in the Sun Belt. And what that means is that it's possible all of these states could be pretty much tied. It's understandable why Democrats are uneasy, because Kamala Harris had a very favorable August and September. She had a great rollout and convention in August. She had a strong debate performance against Trump in early September, and the Fed cut interest rates in mid-September, and yet October is bringing a much more conventional trench warfare feel of a campaign into these states, where both parties are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on scorched earth ads, obliterating the other candidate's image, and that has helped level the playing field. And part of the reason why Trump is performing a touch better this week relative to perhaps 2 or 3 weeks ago is, number one, the memories of the debate are further in the rearview mirror. Number two, his paid communication has been much more effective than his debate performance or his rally appearances, where he tends to get in his own way. Third of all, the Republicans have been able to drive Kamala Harris's negatives back up closer to where they were before she became the nominee.
So, Dave, what do you make of these claims on left-wing Twitter where some Democrats are claiming that there's poll rigging going on with a dump of Republican-sponsored polls distorting the averages? Is there anything to those claims?
Not really, because even mainline polls conducted by news organizations with track records going back many years have found a tightening contest. Now, our polling average at the Cook Political Report does not take into account many of the new fly-by-night pollsters on the block, many of whom have Republican ties. We only look at the 20 national surveys that have well-established track records and do not affiliate with a party. And what we found is that Kamala Harris's national lead has winnowed from about 2.5 points several weeks ago to just about 2 points right now. And so there's been a very small, modest shift in the race towards Trump. Keep in mind that we believe Kamala Harris needs to win the national popular vote by somewhere between 2 and 3 points to win the Electoral College. So she's right on the bubble. This race could not be closer.
And Dave, what about some of these polls where people are going into the crosstabs and identifying the pollsters making some strange decisions about who to consider a likely voter, for example, for their sample, or indeed some demographic decisions as well? Why do they make all of those adjustments rather than just report on the numbers of people they talk to?
Every pollster is making a different assumption about who is going to turn out and vote that may or may not end up being accurate. And part of the reason pollsters have to weight their samples is that we have partisan non-response bias when response rates to traditional telephone methodologies are sub 1%. In fact, we're relying in many of these telephone surveys, even if it's overwhelmingly cell phone samples, to gauge the views of very small number, maybe 1% of people who are picking up the phone to accurately reflect what the other 99% are thinking. Now, online polls are proliferating, and many of them have track records that are now close to where the error has been for telephone polls. But it's harder to peg an online sample to a voter file of who's actually registered to vote. And what many pollsters are doing is weighting their results to how voters recall voting in the 2020 election to ensure they're getting the right mix of people as it pertains to the hard results from 4 years ago. And yet that may misjudge whether one side has an intensity advantage. Truth is that no one knows. We're all going to be in the dark as to the nature of this electorate until we get the first sets of results on November 5th. And even then, it could take a while to know.
Now, given how close the polls have been for the last few months, I can understand why politicians would be vexing over half a point here or there. But for the casual viewer, are we just better off not paying attention to polling this election because the margin of error is so much bigger than the difference between the candidates?
Look, I can think of a lot worse things to pay attention to than polling. Has polling been off by 3 or 4 points when Trump's been on the ballot in 16 and 20? Yes. Has it been more accurate when Trump's been off the ballot in 2018 and 2022? Yes. There's no way to say for sure whether that pattern will repeat from 4 or 8 years ago this time around. And pollsters are taking steps to try and prevent that from happening, but no one's got a foolproof approach. Now, if we disregarded polls entirely and tried to gauge the election result by, say, crowd size at rallies, or fundraising totals, or the number of ads spent, or who has voted early, I think those are much less reliable benchmarks of how the candidates are faring from state to state.
Dave Wasserman, thank you for being with us again on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot of talk about inflation this election, but for parents with young kids, childcare is where inflation seems to be hitting the hardest, and it could influence how they vote. Here's Melina Wicks with the briefing room.
There's a crisis this election. Well, there's lots. So let's be more specific.
There is a childcare crisis.
There is a childcare crisis, and it is actually real and not just something the news is saying because they love alliteration. America invests a lot less in childcare than other OECD countries, and American parents pay a lot more as a percentage of their income as a result. And those costs are going up.
In the last 3 decades, the cost of childcare has risen at nearly twice the rate of inflation. A recent report found having 2 kids in daycare is more expensive than rent in every single state.
Maybe that's why the US Surgeon General says parenting is hazardous to your health. Here I was thinking it was the exposure to cocomelon. On my belly, there's a belly button. If you have a toddler in your life, you know. But it's not just parents who are struggling. Childcare workers are among the lowest paid employees in America, with a median wage of $14.60 an hour. You can earn more stocking shelves at Walmart, a company with such a bad reputation it was once sued nearly 5,000 times in a single year. Childcare is a classic case of market failure. It needs to cost less than parents would earn going back to work. But people also expect the highest standards of care, because we're talking about looking after kids and not a $25 air fryer, as important as those are. Thankfully, both major parties have a plan, I think.
My plan is that no family, no working family should pay more than 7% of their income in childcare. But also, we need to do better for our childcare providers.
Harris wants to make childcare cheaper and pay childcare workers more. So how is she going to pay for it? Oh, it's a secret. Well, thankfully, Trump has that one covered because he has strong views on childcare.
Childcare is childcare.
Yes, it is.
You know, there's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it.
Yes, you do. Okay, long story short, he's going to pay for it with tariffs. The same way Trump is going to do everything.
We're going to be taking in trillions of dollars, and as much as childcare is talked about as being expensive, it's relatively speaking not very expensive.
So Harris has a plan with no details on how to pay for it. And Trump says he can pay for everything, but doesn't have a plan. Maybe that's not so important, given existing plans to help low-income families aren't even being used.
Childcare subsidies are funded by the federal government, but distributed by states. And nationally, only 1 in 7 children who are eligible actually receives them.
There's a lot of reasons for that. There's not enough funding. Many families can't afford daycare even with subsidies. And more than half of Americans live in childcare deserts, where there aren't spots even if you can afford it. With numbers like that, it's no wonder people are saying there's a childcare crisis. Or to put it away, even a kid could understand.
This is very frustrating.
For Israel, the key to defending the country against air attacks is something called the Iron Dome system, which kicks in most but not all the time.
Hey, America, are you suffering from dome envy?
Israel has a dome. Why shouldn't we have a dome? Israel has it. Why don't we have? So they can build a dome, but we don't have a dome ourselves.
It's just not fair. After all,
Americans deserve an iron dome. We deserve to have a dome like other countries have domes. We deserve a dome. We deserve it.
You deserve a dome too. And not just any dome.
We're going to have the greatest dome of them all. We're going to have the greatest dome ever.
The greatest dome ever.
Very much like Israel has, but even better.
Better than Israel's. You might wonder how a dome will work in a large, isolated country with no nearby enemies firing short-range rockets. Well, it'll work like this.
Ding, 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 ding. Boom. Okay. Missile launch. Pshing, boom.
Pew, pew. Pew. And where will it be built?
Much of it will be made right here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Right here in Virginia.
Virginia.
Made right here in Michigan.
Michigan.
And Wisconsin.
And Wisconsin.
Entirely made in Minnesota.
But entirely in Minnesota?
Great state of Georgia, including Montana. Built in New Jersey.
Georgia, Montana, and New Jersey.
A lot of it right here in New Hampshire, actually.
Actually, New Hampshire.
Right here in Florida.
Everywhere but California.
We'll see something coming. I say, don't worry, the dome's going to take care of it. The dome, don't worry about it. The dome will take care of it.
Order now, and the dome will take care of everything. America's Iron Dome. From the people who brought you about a quarter of a border wall.
And that is it for this trip to Planet America. We'll be back at the same time, 9 p.m. next Wednesday night.
And we're going to Fireside Chat on ABC News on Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. And both shows are on ABC, iView, YouTube and Facebook. See you there.
Bye-bye.